Hey, podcast listeners. This will be the last podcast of 2014. It has been an amazing ride with you this far, and I really can't wait to start things up again in 2015. I'll be heading out on vacation during the month of January, so there won't be any new podcasts in your feeds. However, while I'm out on vacation, I will be uploading special patron-only podcasts to the Patreon page. These will be special short discussions on a single story from the region, but only available to patrons of the podcast. If you'd like to sign up for this special feature, go to patreon.com/Asia News Weekly. But if you don't want to, that's cool as well. Don't worry. The Asia Brief, Asia Now, and Asia News Weekly will return in February, and as always, they'll be absolutely free. Thank you for your continued support, and I hope you and yours have an amazing 2015 filled with nothing but awesome sauce. "2014 is only hours away from ending its run. Today we take a look back at the year's news. It's just one conversation taking place in Asia now. Welcome everyone to this very special edition of Asia Now. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for joining me today and downloading and listening to this week's episode. Today is literally the last day of 2014, and in less than 12 hours, the clock will roll past midnight, and with it, the year. To better understand what's to come, it's important to look back and reflect on what was. Joining me today is veteran broadcast journalist and host of the NKNews.org podcast, Kurt Asian. I asked Kurt onto the program to share in no particular order and in his own opinion what some of the most impactful stories from the Asia-Pacific region have been. Kurt, welcome to Asia Now.
Pleasure to be here, Steve.
All right, Kurt, since you are this week's guest, I'm going to throw things over to you, and you can start anywhere you want to, anytime. What do you think has been one of the biggest stories in 2014?
Well, it's interesting. Along several different levels, I've been thinking about this, and there seems to be this theme of contagion that plays into several of the major stories of 2014. If we think about literal contagion, obviously we're talking about this Ebola outbreak that was so intense and still ongoing in West Africa, and that had the rest of the world completely on edge in terms of preventing its spread. Especially our neighbor to the north, North Korea, was extraordinarily paranoid about not letting any possible Ebola suspect in. There was a period of time when they had simply shut down travel and visiting permissions for just about anybody from that zone. Then there's another kind of contagion, sort of a contagion of ideas. We've just been, over the last couple of months, through this period of The Interview. Will it show? Will it not show? And finally, it has come out. A lot of people have seen it. But obviously, that's another kind of idea contagion. North Korea, both in terms of its medical infrastructure and in terms of its ideological infrastructure, seemed to perceive itself as too vulnerable to let in travelers and to let in these ideas. No matter how silly you think the movie may be, certain ideas and certain criticisms are embedded in the movie that obviously North Korea finds incredibly dangerous. And then just next door in China, you have a different kind of contagion, which was the whole Occupy Hong Kong protests. That went on a whole lot longer than anybody really thought it would. You had those starting up around October and going on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And China perhaps being very ham-handed at first in putting those down. And the main reason is that China does not want that sort of idea contagion to spread in the Chinese mainland. China found itself really between a rock and a hard place. It couldn't go in completely forcefully, as in the vein of another Tiananmen Square, but it couldn't allow these sort of street people power protests to thrive either, because there are plenty of other places in China where if people got the idea in their heads to take to the streets, it could be very, very dangerous for China's integrity as a country. So on many levels and in many kind of ways, this idea of contagion, whether it's actual literal contagion or idea contagion, seemed to be a theme in some of the main news stories of 2014.
Yeah, actually, some of those different elements, those specific pieces of that actually made it onto my list. The Ebola thing made my short list. Didn't make my top 5 stories, but I certainly do recall not only North Korea clamping things down, no one who's ever been to Africa can come into our country, but even all the concerns from like the regional health organizations when they met in the Philippines, very concerned about flights coming in and out of Singapore and Hong Kong because of that traffic nexus of people going in and not being able to really identify where they're coming from, could they be contagious and whatnot. So yeah, that is on there. And then of course with the interview and all that comes with the, I guess, the giant Sony hack. Was it a brilliant marketing ploy, or was it really the DPRK and their China office trying to prohibit the release of the film?
Or perhaps even more plausibly, some third-party player, someone that was disgruntled with Sony and had an axe to grind with Sony and just found the cover in the news rush over the interview and sort of used that as camouflage to cover their tracks. It's equally plausible to believe, because at first when this group, GOP, came out, they weren't making much mention of the interview at all. That was just a simple blackmail, and they kind of latched on to the whole interview movie as the news cycle began to escalate. So it's still kind of up in the air, even though the Obama administration has squarely put the blame on North Korea.
Right, and for me, the whole hack really comes down to how the U.S. theaters responded to the threat. In the wake of, I believe it was it The Dark Knight Returns, where they had that unfortunate murder in the Colorado movie theater. As soon as that threat came out, they all pulled out of being willing to show the film. And then Sony was left with no other choice than to remove it from distribution because no one wanted to show it. And that was really the first instance of a cyber attack of this nature having that kind of real world impact.
Well, there was the physical threat in the form of that wording with the, you will have another 9/11 from the terror group. So that kind of gave the theaters both reason and cover to pull the movie. But if you look at it more deeply, it's quite likely that Sony was very happy to pull the movie because of the blackmail threat. What's unexplained now is why Sony decided to go ahead and release the movie if they had that much to lose from another data dump from the hackers. Much of the conventional wisdom in the media seems to be that President Obama simply called them out on the mat at that press conference and sort of shamed Sony into releasing the movie by telling them that he thought it was a mistake to have pulled it in the first place and that they were kind of damaging the fabric of free speech in the United States and caving to terrorists. That seems to be the public impetus for Sony to have shown the movie after all.
Right, and a lot of the public also came out, and if you listen to some of the news reports, those who went to the theater say, oh, even though I had no intention of seeing the film, it was my patriotic duty to see it.
It's a powerful movie. It's silly. It's everything that you would expect from these two guys. But there are some salient points in the movie and some well-researched data points about North Korea and some pretty piercing satire about how North Korea represents itself to its own people.
Going on to the Hong Kong protests, that was something that, like you mentioned, went on far longer than all of us thought it would be able to last. And even this past weekend, there were some more people out in the streets and arrests being made. And I'm really curious to see, just because of how many students were involved with this, what this means for the next generation or two. The older people seem to be, I guess, resigned to the fact that they have to deal with Beijing and know that's going to be a very long fight, whereas the younger generation really are sticking to their guns, trying to get things done now. How realistic that is probably isn't very, but that's certainly the direction that they're going in, and trying to see how Beijing turns this around to see how they're going to deal with these next two generations.
It's interesting. I mean, on the surface of these Occupy Hong Kong protests, you have basically an administrative argument about how elections are going to be conducted and who has the right to run and who Hong Kong voters can vote for. And that's a fine, legitimate debate about the process of democracy. But on a deeper level, there's a lot that's in common with the Occupy Wall Street movement. And that's probably why, they've named it Occupy Central. This is in large part an inequality debate, an economic inequality and a debate about opportunity and economic indicators like housing prices and so on. And that is linked to the extent to which Hong Kong government leaders are perceived to be kowtowing to Beijing. The ones that get in tight with Beijing and the sort of lapdogs of the Beijing government tend to be nowadays in modern Hong Kong, the ones that are at the sort of cream economically, the ones that are in with the sort of oligarchy of the economic system. And I think a lot of people that were out on the street are angry first and foremost about that. Then, of course, Hong Kong has always enjoyed a special identity in the world and economically because of its rule of law and the fact that it can make its own rules and it can deal with the rest of the world in a different way. In their hearts, I think a lot of Hong Kong people are afraid of becoming just another Chinese city, just another one of these cities up and down the coast, firmly under the thumb of Beijing, and nothing particularly special to offer the world. And then, of course, there's that democratic point. They want to be able to self-determine without having Beijing veto their democracy. It's what they were promised at handover, and they want to be able to choose and vote for their own candidates. That problem, incidentally, has not gone away. Even though the camps and the Occupy Central sites have been dispersed, those elections are coming up and there's still no agreement between Beijing and the Hong Kong people. So I think we can expect to see something flare up again at some point, perhaps in 2015.
I think you're absolutely right. And I wouldn't be surprised if over the new year, we wouldn't actually see some type of activity there. Going on to your list, what is something else that you have for us?
Well, I mean, the big thing coming up in 2015, I believe it's in June or August, I can't remember the month, but we have a meeting in Paris, which is kind of the last-ditch attempt to reach a global climate agreement. And 2014 was just one warning after another from the United Nations, from NGOs, from just about every corner except for the outright climate deniers, that we are running out of time to make serious changes in the way carbon is produced around the world, or will experience irreversible and severe weather effects. And those things are going to hit the poor and often our region, Asia, Southeast Asia, the Philippines, places that are, of course, next to the water, the hardest. The infrastructure is weak in places like that, and rising sea levels affect not only, the dramatic things that you see in storms and typhoons and hurricanes, but they affect things like salinity in the agricultural fields. They bring a higher level of mosquitoes and mosquito-transmitted diseases, all kinds of knock-on effects. So really the stakes are very high for a deal to be reached in Paris this year. And we saw at least one good sign between President Obama and Xi Jinping in China with a real breakthrough U.S.-China climate accord. This is an accord between sort of the two fundamentally different sides of the climate debate. On one side, the United States, which has basically polluted its way to prosperity for 200 some odd years, and China, which represents sort of the emerging economies around the world that has not enjoyed the same prosperity and needs a path to creating wealth and basic services for hundreds of millions of people. India would also be in that column. It will take some persuading to get China and India away from these carbon-producing technologies like coal and into new technologies that are clean. So China seems to be assuming a mantle of leadership, and we hope that will produce something in Paris.
No, I agree. In fact, some scientists have already come out and said it's not trying to, stave off climate change. We're past that. It's already too late. Now it's how we deal with it. And I think that's a good point. And that landmark agreement between the United States and China it wasn't at the ASEAN meeting. It was the one before then, the East Asia Summit,
right?
Which I thought was really surprised, caught a lot of people off on that as well. So we have a lot of China stories. I'm noticing a lot of China stories. One of my picks is Xi Jinping's consolidation of power, because he hasn't been in office all that long. And specifically this year, you have the quote-unquote war on terror in the Xinjiang region against the Uyghur people and the Uyghur terrorists. You have the quote-unquote graft war, where he's just eliminating anyone who has any kind of ill-gotten deeds, really showing up his power. And it's translating also into how he's negotiating with other countries, essentially saying it's my way or the highway. And you're going to deal with the way I want to do things or forget about it.
Yeah, and a much more muscular role in China, although that's kind of happening under a lot of people's radars, with the exception of the Africans themselves. I have a friend who runs a podcast similar to yours called the China in Africa podcast, and they examine every aspect of how China is infusing its power, its soft power and its hard power. They're, for example, sending combat troops to Sudan, a very unprecedented move for China. They're sending, there's no way to count, but tens of millions of immigrant expats, basically to move to Africa and set up businesses. And they're doing all kinds of infrastructure projects and joint ventures. And it is becoming a very Chinese continent. And there will be, of course, at some point, and as humans meet each other and settle down, there will be an intermixture. They even have a word for it called Chinafricans. And it's really an interesting phenomenon that's happening. On the sidebar of all those things that you mentioned, with China taking a more muscular role in so many other things in the world. Remember, China owns a whole lot of U.S. debt as well. And that is going to become a big, big theme in coming years, if not in this next year. We have a Republican Congress and another 2 years of a Democratic president who have to manage to hash out budgets together. China will be watching that process very, very carefully, and also watching what happens to the U.S. dollar, and I suspect influencing it behind the scenes with a fairly robust counsel to all the players in the U.S. economy, because the U.S. economy is heading towards trouble, I think, with the debt levels that it has, mainly payable to China.
That is true. They're one of the largest debt holders for the United States. And and that's the thing that I don't want to say worries me, but concerns me is how assertive China is getting, especially as you take a look into the South China Sea, the East China Sea, which is also on my list, because while there has always been some kind of conflict, some kind of animosity between ASEAN countries and Japan with China over territorial rights, this year we have seen so many more of those conflicts. You had the oil rig being moved into the exclusive economic zone of Vietnam, and the actual physical clashes between Coast Guard vessels and fishing boats there, sinking of vessels. You have now the reclamation in the Fiery Cross Reef near the Philippines, which is in their territorial waters, which could support an airstrip and naval base. You have the United States coming out now saying that it doesn't believe the 9-dash line has any merit whatsoever, and that everyone needs to go back to the table to really solidify the code of conduct for the China Sea area. But China doesn't want to do it. And it seems like we're moving towards an impasse between ASEAN members, the United States and China, coming up in 2015.
Yeah, and we saw several players down there in Southeast Asia looking increasingly to India as a counterbalance, just as the United States has looked to India as a counterbalance to China in the past. A major agreement with Vietnam and India this year to share all kinds of assets, and granting, interestingly, India some offshore exploration rights, so that could at some point put Indian boats in conflict with what China says is its territorial waters. That will be something interesting to watch in 2015. I think China is ultimately, it's flexing muscles, but it's ultimately a rational player, and it's probably some someone that the rest of the world can work with. There are really only a couple of red lines or tripwires with China that would cause serious conflict. Of course, Taiwan is one, Tibet is another, and any perception of interfering with either of those two hot-button issues, or to a lesser extent with other restive regions like Xinjiang and so on, would be seen by China in a very hostile way. Other than that, we'll have to see just how far China is willing to push on these South and East China Sea kind of issues.
Yeah, it should be a very interesting year in that region. What else is on your list?
Yeah, one interesting thing that's kind of neatly contained in 2014 was the rise of Narendra Modi in India. He swept away what is basically several decades of Congress Party rule in India. There was a little period 10 years ago or so when the BJP, his party, was in power, but that was extinguished pretty quickly. The Congress Party has been in charge of India for decades and decades, and Indian voters spoke in a pretty robust way to say that they were tired of the Congress Party, and they were tired of a lot of the corruption that is perceived to be attached to the Congress Party. They were swept out. Narendra Modi comes in, a controversial guy with some baggage from his home state of Gujarat, where he's accused of kind of looking the other way during anti-Muslim massacres. Of course, he's from a Hindu nationalist party, which is kind of some of the more extremist Hindu elements kind of fall under that umbrella. But really, he's been taken on by Indian voters as a change agent, sort of a turnaround CEO type figure in India. And, the U.S. has completely changed positions on him. He was denied a visa to the U.S. not too long ago because of that anti-Muslim massacre incident. But then just this year, he made a showing in Madison Square Garden, almost like a massive, glitzy NBA kind of show, a massive concert, several hundreds of thousands of Indians gathering in the city, chanting his name, gave a 70-minute address there in New York in Hindi. And he's playing to this whole, resurgence of Mother India again, not just to the audiences at home, but to the diaspora audiences of very successful Indian expats around the world, almost inviting them to come home and to participate in a resurgent India. So he's going to face some pressures in 2015. We've already seen some of these headlines about mass conversions of Muslims and Christians and attempts to rally these people, sometimes under somewhat sneaky circumstances, telling them they're going to receive ration cards and things like that, and then actually trying to convert them. So a lot of Indians are lobbying for a law against conversions, and he's going to be on the spot to balance those two constituencies, the Hindus that believe so strongly in him, and then the rest of India, which is either of a different faith altogether or wants to cling to the secular constitution of India. But he did a good thing in Gujarat, so let's see if he can do that nationwide.
That is a very good point. That is actually one thing that I did not have on my list, so kudos for that. No, it was really interesting to watch the entire election process take place earlier this year. On my list, I wasn't sure if I was going to put this on here, but I decided to do it just because it had such an impact for the nation in which we both live on, and that was the Sewol hull sinking earlier this year in April, the Sewol ferry. And it exposed the long-standing safety issues that have been in the country for more than 20 years. It has really paralyzed the country in many ways in, the government not being able to enact the special prosecutor investigation arm earlier this year. And still, we see that the nation still hasn't, even though it's identified that there are several safety concerns, it hasn't really moved forward with correcting them, because even now at the Lotte World construction site in Seoul, we're having more and more safety issues come up, with the aquarium having holes and workers falling off scaffolding because they're not safely secured. It really shows that if you do have an industrialized nation that progresses very quickly, sometimes there are omissions that take place, and shows that no matter how quickly and how advanced Seoul and South Korea is at the moment, there are still room for improvement. And sometimes people tend to look at the monetary rewards rather than the social ramifications of bypassing those safety concerns.
Right. And that goes back to the whole India thing that we were just talking about, with corruption. Corruption is endemic in all of Indian society. At every level, it is an infestation. And just as in sort of the security and safety aspect of South Korea, it's very desirable to make statements from on high and to enact policies and to do sort of highly visible steps like disbanding the Coast Guard and so on. But how do you change the nesting of human behaviors and human relationships across all of the levels of society that go into the daily building of buildings or zoning or construction and operation of ferries? That is an extensive task to completely turn around all of those cultures. It starts with laws from the top, but it's about educating and enforcing those practices across all of society. So it's a slow turnaround. Hopefully, South Korea will be consistent and not just have its memory fade with this Sewol tragedy and go back to business as usual.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the main concerns. I spoke with Oh Young-jin, who's the managing editor of the Korea Times, right after the Sewol sinking, and he said exactly that. A lot of times there's a huge accident, people are outraged. They ask the questions, why did this happen? There's political maneuverings to enact laws to stop it from happening again, but nothing gets done. Then we have another accident, and then people ask the same questions again, and it's a perpetual cycle.
Right, right. It's in the news cycle, and when it leaves the news cycle, out of sight, out of mind, unfortunately.
Exactly, unfortunately. Going on to your list, sir, what else is on there?
Well, I think going back to the interview, I think one of our early 2015 stories may continue to touch upon the interview in the sense that these activist groups, defector groups, human rights groups, have made no secret in recent news stories that they want to start launching balloons again, launching balloons into North Korea. And they're planning as early as January to launch balloons loaded with copies of the interview, okay? Bombing North Korea with Seth Rogen. And whereas you and I can kind of shrug off this movie and even maybe, damn it with faint praise and say, yeah, there was some interesting satire in there, this is an unbelievably toxic movie for North Korea and the North Korean government. And there's every reason to believe that someone found with a copy of the interview or found watching it has a very dim future in North Korea. This is not the kind of thing that North Korea can afford to have a lot of people see. It's very dangerous in terms of the ideas expressed and also just the takedown of Kim Jong-un from his God status, the way he's portrayed. So if North Korea knows that these launches are going to contain the interview, and if these groups are, shall we say, foolish enough to announce their launch date and to make a big press event out of it, I think there is a very serious risk that North Korea would take some kind of retaliatory measures, maybe even consider shooting at the balloons or shooting at something else. So I think one of our very early headlines is going to have to do with that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I agree with you. And we've already seen them shoot down the weather balloons before, and that was just with leaflets and CDs. So, and this week we've already seen the headlines that the activist groups are going to send the balloons with copies of the interviews. They're already telegraphing it right now. So, in my mind, they will telegraph, okay, we are going to launch the balloons from here. And the other concern I have, not only with North Korea shooting down those balloons, is that we saw it in Paju and we saw it in some other locations where the citizens are so worried about the repercussions from North Korea that they go out and try to stop the balloons themselves.
Indeed. I saw a couple of interesting news headlines on the periphery of this. One is according to sort of a defector-run radio station, Free North Korea Radio, so you can take it with a grain of salt if you want. But they say that the demand for the interview movie in North Korea is so high now that black market prices to get the DVD or the copy of the film are 10 times higher than for, say, other films that you might buy on the black market, Titanic or James Bond or something. So there's that. And then there's another headline where South Korea is reaching out to North Korea for talks in January. Now, that could be completely separate, but perhaps this is some kind of leverage. Perhaps if South Korea quietly promises to delay, suppress, prevent, curtail launches of this movie into North Korean territory, that might be a card they can play with North Korea. Then again, all of these things may be completely separate, but it's something to think about. It certainly gives South Korea a card to play in terms of promising North Korea to maybe crack down on something that North Korea will absolutely find incendiary, way more provocative than the usual sort of leaflets and choco pies and things like that.
Yeah, I hopefully will not have to read any headlines or report any headlines of any kind of conflict regarding this. I hope that cooler heads prevail.
Mm-hmm. At the same time, though, getting materials into North Korea is an important thing. I'm on the fence about what I think about these balloon launches in general. I do think that there are dangers, but if there's no other way, if the border is sealed with China and you can't get smugglers to take in South Korean materials and materials like that, maybe the balloon launches are a good thing, but I do think they're becoming more dangerous.
On that note, I think that's a good place to wrap things up for this week. My guest this week has been Kurt Asian. He is a veteran broadcast journalist and the host of the nknews.org podcast. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you and yours have an absolutely amazing 2015.
Great to be here, Steve. Thank you.
Before I go, I'd love to hear from you on what stories had the most impact in your life this past year. Please leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. If you haven't found us on social media, those addresses are facebook.com/AsianNewsWeekly or @AsianNewsWeekly on Twitter. You can also send an email to the show with your questions or feedback. Just drop a line to podcast@AsianNewsWeekly.net. If you enjoyed this week's show, please share it with your friends. And of course, you can subscribe to this and other podcasts on our website. Just click the tab that says subscribe at the top of the page, or those big iTunes and Stitcher buttons. Subscribing is free, and when you do, that next episode is delivered automatically to you. Remember, this is the last podcast until February of 2015. So until then, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your support. And for Asia Now, I'm Steve Miller. Asia Now is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 international license.